In this video, we will learn about Formik. Formik is a very powerful way and a very easy way to build forms in React. And along with Yup, which is used for validation, Formik and Yup together form a very powerful tool set. So what is Formik? Formik is a group of React components for building forms. They help in getting values in and out of the form state, validation and error messages. So validating the fields in the form, they help in doing that, and displaying suitable error messages and handling form submission. So as we use Formik in our examples, as we write that code, you will get a far better idea of these features and the power that these features provide us. To use Formik, go ahead and install it, the standard installation that we use typically, npm install Formik. So while we are using Formik in this video, we will look at some simple cases of Formik. And here, some of the values we typically use are initial values, a JSON with the initial values for input fields. So for the input fields, we would need a set of initial values. Typically, when we make our standard forms, in the state we create those initial values. This is very similar to it. Similarly, we need to define onSubmit, which is what to do when submit is clicked. And for validation, the two most common techniques in Formik is validate, a function for field level and form level validation, and validation schema, which will use Yup to define the validation schema. So these are the things that we will focus on. For those who are interested in learning more about Formik, you can go and read the docs after this video and look at the other features and the capabilities Formik provides. So Formik provides a lot of configurable and a lot of powerful features which you can go and read here, and depending upon as you start using it, your use cases, you can use them. The typical structure of Formik is that each input is called a field. So field is there to take inputs. The default is input, otherwise specify it in as. So as equal to select means it's a drop down. As is equal to text area would mean it's a text area. And the name attribute is used to match. So the name attribute you give to the field is used to match. Also there is a error message which renders the error message of a given field if that field has been visited. So these are the two things we typically define for each field in our input, each input field. So the field and the error message. So let's do an example, and as we do it, it will become clearer. Create a form using Formik which takes the name, age and country of a person as input. Note, country is a drop down. So name and age are normal text fields input, and country is a drop down. So here in our VS Code, we have defined three components: main component, display details and person form. So the main component, what does main component do? It has a simple route, and on /persons add, it calls the person form with a submit button with a onSubmit, which will just push it into the persons in the state. That's what it does. And then the slash maps to display details, which is the other component, which will just display all the details of these persons. So if you go to the display details, so display details is just showing the details of all the persons it got in the props, and it also has just as an add button, which will just call the /person/add, which is our person form. So a simple structure here. So what is our objective? Our objective is to develop this person form. So let us start developing our person form. Import React component from. Next, what do we need to do? We will import our Formik pieces. So we need Formik, we need field, and we need form from Formik. Let's define our class person form extends component. Let's define a state in it. So this state will be used to display the dropdown for the countries. So it has an array countries. Let's call it, say, let's put some values in it. Now that we have done it, let's go define our render. Let person is an empty JSON. So initially there is an empty JSON. So let's map it to it. Let's define our Formik form. So return, and now here we will put in a Formik. As we said, we will need to define our initial values. So what are our initial values for Formik? We would need name for the person, which is an empty string. We would need age, which is an empty string, and we would need country, which is also an empty string. So these are our initial values. Next, what do we need to define? We need to define our onSubmit. OnSubmit is equal to values goes to, and what will it do on submit? This dot props dot, what was the function we had passed in our props? On submit. So we will use that, this dot props dot on submit, and these values would be passed. So the values here basically means this person would be passed, this object person would be passed. And once we can do it, we can just say this dot props dot history dot push, and we would just go to the slash to display the details. Once we have done this, let's now start defining our fields in the form. So form, now within this form, we will typically write our text, our standard, the way we typically write stuff. So let's say h4 details of the person. Next, what do we want to do? Let's put in a div class name is equal to form group, and within that, let's put in its label. Say label is name. Now we will define the input element, so that we will now define as a field. Name is equal to name. We had said name will be used for matching, so that's why we've given the name as name. Type is text, and class name is equal to form control. So we have defined our field. So that's the first field we have defined. Similarly, let's define our next div class name is equal to form group. This will be for age. Very similar, we will define it. Label will be age, and then field name will be age. Type will again be text, and class name is form control. So we have defined both these fields. Now we need to define our country. Now country will be a drop down. So let's see how do we do that. So before defining it as a drop down, what do we need to do? We will need to get the list of countries. So let's do that stuff first. So const countries is equal to this dot state. So typically in a drop down, we will need to show a display value and the value when it's selected. So let's just use map for it. So we can say let countries1 is equal to countries dot map. C1 goes to, and let's return a JSON. Value is C1 and display is C1. Let us also on top put select the country. So we can just say countries1 dot unshift, and what should we give it? Value is an empty string, and display would be in this case be say select the country. So now we have countries1. Let's go ahead and try and define our drop down. So here we can just say again div class name is equal to form group. Now within that, what is our label? Our label is country. And now within that, we want to define a drop down. So we will say field name is what? Country. As is equal to select. So for a drop down, the as we discussed would be a select. Next, what do we want to do? Class name is equal to form control. So now within this, we will define all our drop down options. So we will use a map. So countries1 dot map. C1 goes to, and what will it will generate an option for each. So what would the option say? Value is equal to C1 dot value. That is what we had created. And then what are we displaying in it? We can also give it a key so that we don't get a key is equal to C1 dot display, and within it we can display our C1 dot display. So that is our option that we have created. So once we have created this option, we will just close our field tag, our div, and now what do we need? We need the add button. So let's just put that div class name is equal to form group, and within that, how do we put it? We can just put in a button. Type is equal to submit. Class name is equal to say btn primary, and what's the text we want to show there? Say add, and let's just get say an MR2. So now that we have done that, we will close our form or this, and then close our Formik. So once we have closed all of this, this should work fine for us. Let's go ahead and test it. So unexpected token, what's the error? This should have been a colon. Let's go ahead and test it again. Does not contain a default export. Let's export it. export default person form module not form. What error did we make? This was the error. And we now get the details of the person. So there are two persons initially. When we click on add, we are getting another issue. Let's look at the it is not showing us anything here. So let's put in, say, a console.log person form. Let's see, what do we get? Add new person, we get the person form, but nothing is getting displayed. Let's test that out. Why? So what was the error? The error is when we are returning, this is a return. So this cannot be within this bracket. It's a JSX we are returning. So it should have been this bracket here. So again, we need to be slightly careful. So let's make that change. That would have made it a start of a code or a JSON. That's how we do that. So that was the problem. We are returning this. Let's go back and test it. And now we have gotten a form. Let's put in the name. Let's put in, say, Tim, age, say, 33, and let's set the correct country as France. And we get that value in. Let's put in another one. Stephen, 45, country Canada, and add. So this is how we have used a Formik to do it. So this is how we have defined our form using field. And as we proceed in this exercise, we will see more advantages that we get from using Formik. Next, what do we want to do? Use the same form to edit the details of a person. So we have displayed it. Now we want to edit it. Now to edit it, what are the changes we would need to do? So we will need to add another route to edit it. So let's put that in. Let's define the route as :index/edit. That's typically how do we define it? Props. So what all would be the props? We will need to pass it persons. Let's say we pass it persons also. And the handle submit person will now need to handle the edit case also. So it will get a so in our handle submit person, let's also get the index from the in the submit. So now if we get the index, then here we can just say if index is truthy, then what do? We can just say persons 1 plus index, we are getting it as a string, is equal to the person we have gotten, else we push it. So that's the change. So this will now get updated or it will get posted. Similarly, in our display details, we will need to make a change. We will need to add another field here, say, which is edit. So there will be a button we'll need to add. Let's maybe copy the text of this button here. So we put in a button. Let's call it, say, warning. And this would be edit person, and let's call it edit. And this edit person will be called with the index. So we will need to pass the index, and let's now define a function edit person which takes an index. And what does it call? It calls index and /edit, and then the main component will route it. So these are the changes we have made to our main component and our display details. Next, what are the changes we will need to do in our person form? So notice in this case, in our person form, what are the props we are getting? In the props, if we look at it, we get the persons, which is the array of persons, and we are gonna get the index from the params. So now what do we do here? So here let's get our persons. So const persons is equal to this dot props. That is what we can get. Similarly, we can get our index from this dot props dot match dot params. So we have gotten both our persons and index. Now instead of this always being this, if index is truthy, then this will be persons plus index, because index is a string as you get it. Otherwise it's an empty JSON. So that's the change we have done. And in the initial values, we will need to change it because there could be values here. So person dot name, or it's an empty string. Person dot age, or it's an empty string. And similarly person dot country, or it's an empty string. So that's the change. Those are the initial values going to the Formik. So when we do that, we will need to send the index also. So let's send the index. And here we can just make a change. So instead of showing add, if index is truthy, then what do? We show update details, else we show add. So the person form, we can show different text on the button. Let's go ahead and test it. So we have this and the edit button. Let's first add a person. Let's say Tim 44 and France. So we have these three persons. Let's edit Brad. So we get Brad. All the data is now showing. Let's change the country to France. So that's changed. Let's change the age to 29. We can see that changed. Brad, let's make it Brad Smith. And that has also changed. For the value we added, let's make a change. And that has also happened. So the edit is now working fine. Next, what do we want to do? Add the following validations. Name, age, country are required. Name should have at least 6 characters. And age should be a number not less than 0 or greater than 100. So these are the validations we want to add to our Formik form. So how should we do that? So here we will not need to make any change to our main component or our display details. All we need to do is handle this in our person form. So how do we do that? So if there is an error, we will also need to display an error message. So let's also get error message from Formik. Next, what do we need to define here is the validation. So let's say person validate is equal to, it takes the values as parameter, and what does it return? It returns a errors. So const errors is equal to, now what this function that we are defining here takes values, which is the JSON, the person JSON as parameter. That is what Formik will give it, and it will now configure all the errors in it. So we will push those errors into it and return it. So what are the values we wanted to? So if not values dot name. So if name is not defined, then what do? Errors dot name is equal to name is required. We wanted that field, so we have defined that. Else, if values dot name dot length is less than 6. We wanted name to be at least 6 characters. Errors dot name is equal to name should have minimum 6 characters. So just to understand it, we have passed that persons that Formik will pass, and we are now constructing our array errors for each of these fields. So we have done for name. Next we want to do for age. Same stuff here. If values dot age. If this is, then what do we need to say? Errors dot age is equal to age is required. Else what do we want? We want to do a few checks. First, it should be a number. So how do we check whether it's a number? Else if is nan, not a number, values dot age. So we are converting values into a number, and we are checking if we get a is nan error. So if is nan not a number there, then we will just say errors dot age is equal to age should be a number. Else if, what do we want to check? That the age should have been between 0 and 100. So now we know it is a number. So if plus values dot age less than 0. If it is less than 0, then what do we want to say? Errors dot age is equal to age cannot be less than 0. Else what do we want to do? Else if values dot age is greater than 100, then errors dot age is equal to age cannot be greater than 100. So we have defined all the 4 conditions for age. What were the 4 errors? Either it's required. If it is filled in, it should be a number. If it is a number, it should be between 0 and 100. So we have given appropriate error messages for all of them. And what is the third one? Countries is mandatory. So again, if not values dot country, errors dot country is equal to country is required. And now once we have constructed our errors, we will return it. So we have defined it, and note that we have defined this function outside the component. So this is not a function of the component. We have just defined this function outside the component. Now once we have defined it, how do we use it? Like we have done our onSubmit. So we can define our validate. Validate is equal to, and what's the name of that function? Person validate. So we are now configuring in Formik that the validate will be this function. So now that we have configured it, we also need to show our error messages. So let's show our error messages. So how do we show our error messages? So after our field, we can just show here div class name is equal to, say, text danger. Let's show it in that red color, and we show that error message name is equal to name. So we are showing the error message name here. Formik will figure out from the errors and show it. Similarly here it will be age. So same way we need to define the error message for country. So let us put in the field of the error message after the field tag. So this field tag is closing here. After that we put it name is equal to country. So let us go ahead and test it. So it gives us an error on line 9. Let's go ahead and check. Line 9 is, it should have been values. Let's test it again. So now we are getting it. Let's add a new person and let's say click submit. So we get the errors. Name is required, age is required, and country is required. Let's put in a name, say Tim. And we get the error, name should be at least 6 characters. Let's put in Timothy, this works fine. Let's put in something here. Age should be a number. Let's put in 456, cannot be greater than 100. Minus 9 cannot be less than 0. Select the country, say Canada. And now when I submit, it allows my submit. So this is my validation. Same for the edit. If I now try and update it, it says age is required. Now if I put it 28, this is working fine. Country is required, so I need to select it. And same way for the name. Name is required, so let's put it back, Brad Williams. Update the details and this is working fine. So this is how we have validated it. So what are the 2 steps we did? We defined this function person validate and we configured it in Formik. We gave it this function and then we used the error message to display these messages. So this is how we validate a form using Formik. Next, what do we want to do? In the above created form, take inputs for tech and current status. Use checkboxes for tech and radio buttons for current status. Both tech and current status are required. So we will need to add a couple of more fields to do that. So let's do it. So let's first define in our state technologies and similarly we want current status. So let's define something, let's call it say current statuses. And what are the values here? Say student, working, or let's say looking for a job. So now we have defined it. Now what do we need to do? We need to put it in our persons. So in our initial values, let's define it. So we will need 2 more fields here. Let's call it say tech. Now tech is, if we go back, is a checkbox. So it can have multiple values. So we'll create an array, whereas for current status, it's a single value. So we'll create a string. So person dot say tech, or it's an empty array. So we have defined it this way, and let's call it say current status is person dot current status or an empty string. So we have defined it. Now what is the next thing we need to do? We need to update it in our validate also. So we can just say if values dot tech dot length equal to 0. That's an array. So if the length is equal to 0, then errors dot tech will be choose at least one technology. So that is what we can say. Similarly, if not values dot current status, then we can say errors dot current status is equal to status is required. So we have defined our errors, we have initialized the values. Now what do we need to do? We need to create the fields. So let's create the first field. So we will create it here after our countries. So again, div class name is equal to form group. Now what do we do? Label class name is equal to, no margin we want, and let's just give it some padding, and let's say technologies. No. Now we have given it the label. Now we need to show all the checkboxes. So we will map on technologies. So we will need to also get it like countries, technologies, comma, current statuses. So we will need it from the state. So now we can say here technologies dot map, say T1 goes to, and what do we say here? Div class name is equal to form check inline. So we are showing all the values inline. So form check inline, key is equal to, let's say, T1, the technology. And within that we will define our field. What is the name? It is tech. What is the type? It is checkbox. What is the value? Value is T1, and class name is equal to form check input. So we will define our field, and within the field what we can now say is, after the field we will just define our label. So what is our label? Let's just put in a class name, form check label. And what is our label? It will be T1. So we have defined our technologies. So we have given it the fields, and each of these fields will get mapped now onto it. Next, what do we need to define? We need to define our radio for the current status. So let's define that. Div class name is equal to form group. Now within that we can just say label class name is equal to, and which is very similar to what we did. So let's just copy that part of it. And here we are saying current status. Similarly, inside what we will have, we will now create a map. What is that map? We will now go on current statuses dot map. Say status 1 goes to, and what do we say here? We will create a div again. Div class name is equal to form check inline, key is equal to S1. That's the key in this case. And within that div, what we will do? We will define our field. Name is equal to current status. What is our type? Type is equal to radio. Then we have our value is equal to s1, and what do we need to define? Our class name. Class name is equal to form check input. So now that we have defined our field, we can now after that define our label. So what is our label? Label class name is equal to form check label, and within the label we can just define our s1. So this should also work. So this is identical to it. The core difference being, so this is giving us an error map s1. So there should this, and this is showing red. Why is that so? Div has closed, field has closed. So this is now fine. So this is very similar, both of them. The only major difference, if you remember, we created this as an array, this as a string, and then we have given the appropriate types, checkbox and radio. Once we have done that, we also need to update our display details. Why? We will need to show those values. So let's show that also. So this would be p1.tech and p1.currentStatus. So let's say if multiple values are being chosen, so this should work fine. Let's test it. So here we get it. Let's put in commas. So let's just put in, say, a join comma. So we get it. So we're getting all the technologies, we are getting the status, and we are getting the edit button. Let's add a new person first. So let's put it as a Timothy, age 23, country France. So now when we add it, we're not getting the error messages. Why? Because we did not put those error messages. So it's not submitting because it is an error, but we did not display the error messages. Let's do that. So how and where do we display it? So after the map, so let's just copy the error message. Is tech, and here the error message would be current status. So let us go back and test it. Now if I add a person, so we get all our error messages. Choose at least one technology. Let's put in the name. If I submit it, it's not allowing me to submit. So this error message is gone. Let's put it JavaScript React. Current status, let's say student. This is not selectable. Now what is the issue here? Let's fix that. So again, what is the error here? We have called it values. So this should have been value. So that's how we define this field. Let's go back and test it. So let's define Timothy, 23, Canada, JavaScript React. This is required. Let's click student. Now I can select it, and we can see we have gotten this perfect. Now if I click on edit, does it show me properly? Yes, all of them are selected. Let's say select node.js, make it working. So JavaScript node.js working, and this seems to be working fine. I can go ahead and edit all of them. So this seems to be working absolutely fine.